And I do think there are war crimes that the United States committed during the Second World War, the firebombing of Tokyo, famously Dresden, that were a collective punishment.
Why are we talking about how many lives it would save? It's just wrong to drop the bomb? Well, no, actually.
I find it fascinating that many conservatives are now lambasting Tucker Carlson.
Talk about what Bomber Harris did and the RAF did against German cities. This was a war crime. They were purposely bombing working class areas in German cities.
The goal is to have an endless war.
Welcome back to Rattlesnake TV, guys. In this video, we are going to be covering a recent debate that has been taking place on Twitter, various podcasts, various different people's shows regarding the subject of US foreign policy, their conduct during World War II, and whether or not we should be questioning the narrative that has been fed to us about history. And this is a particularly important topic right now because one may argue that we are actually living through World War III, albeit with the US involved by proxy rather than a hot war. Yet. Touch wood. You see, we're living through a moment where these questions are more relevant than ever. Because as these tensions continue to escalate, intelligent leaders with wisdom and foresight and who genuinely desire peace, as opposed to dumb, compromised politicians who genuinely desire war, are more important than ever. And in the age of the internet, in the age of information, this conversation must also necessarily include thought leaders and major political commentators. So we are living through a very interesting time in terms of conservative thought and conservative media. Some of the biggest and most influential voices in the space have been fired or liberated from their corporations that they were previously working for. And some people think that this is a really bad thing. We should be fighting the left. We shouldn't be eating our own. And whilst that's a decent point, it's also important to understand, and we'll keep it to America for the sake of the video, that the modern conservative movement that's spearheaded by the likes of Tucker Carlson, Vivek Ramaswamy, and Candace Owens for that matter, is a very different strain of politics than that of the likes of George Bush, Nikki Haley, Ben Shapiro. And much of the difference between this modern conservative America First type politics and the neocon politics is the way that they view America's role in the world stage. And so with that in mind, Tucker Carlson was obviously fired by Fox News, the biggest establishment brand of conservative media in the world, who are at least better than CNN, to be fair.
I'm going to cut you off. Can we please cut him off? Can we take him off the screen? Can we take him? Can we get rid of John Fredericks? Thank you. I was going to let him speak until you doubly insulted me.
But when it comes to foreign conflicts and America's role in them, they have been espousing neocon warhawk politics for decades. And during the time of the Iraq War, Tucker was espousing the exact same politics.
A lot of entertainers have come out against the war in Iraq. Have you?
Honestly, I think we should just trust our president in every decision that he makes, and we should just support that, you know, and be faithful in what happens.
Do you trust this president?
Yes, I do.
Which now he has openly come out and said that he was wrong about.
My life, since I was doing the same thing, I wasn't working on a construction site when I was 25. I was in the political media in Washington, and I stayed there from 1991 to 2020. So I look back at myself and I'm like, I can't believe, for example, I supported the war in Iraq. Why did I do that? Now, I think to my credit, I went to Iraq in 2003 and realized I'd been completely wrong, and I said so. I didn't continue to lie, but I did go along with things I was uncomfortable with. I didn't ask difficult enough questions, and I wound up supporting something that was really bad for the United States and evil, in my opinion.
Now, Tucker appears to have completely turned his back on that world. He has the humility to come out and say he was wrong, he was lied to, and the truly patriotic position is not to just champion forever wars, and it's not to just drink the Kool-Aid and accept the current and historical narratives just fed to you by your government and by your media who are clearly compromised. No, the patriotic thing to do is to support peace, to support diplomacy, to support not being a bully on the world stage, and to support actually draining the swamp of the bloodthirsty establishment monsters that have infested it.
Drain the swamp.
Patriotism does not mean blind, obsequious obedience, and if anybody in any facet of your life ever demands that of you, they do not love or respect you. Ben Shapiro, for example, could not be more clear about his condemnation of those who want to ask questions.
You blame society, you don't have an answer. So it must be a conspiracy. There must be some sort, and you're just asking questions. You don't know, right? This is the game that is played by so many corrupt commentators, just asking questions. I don't have to show you evidence that something terrible is happening. I don't have to actually demonstrate how the thing is happening. I don't have to tell you who the problem is. Wink, wink. But I can just tell you right now that there is a problem. But even, and if I'm asked about it, hey, I'm just asking questions. Now, let me tell you something about just asking questions for a second. Just asking questions is a game for children. My son is 7. He can just ask questions. My daughter is 10. She can just ask questions. If you are 50 and you are just asking questions, I don't think you're just asking questions. I think that your level of curiosity is actually quite low. I think that you don't care enough to know or know enough to care. I think that the vast majority of people who are in the just asking questions business have an answer that they want to suggest, but they know there's no evidence for it, so instead they hide behind just asking questions. In other words, they're completely full of shit.
Are they really full of Ben, or are they flying directly over the target? And is that maybe why you're freaking out and firing your verbal machine gun into the distance, hoping that something lands? And also, are they really just these faux sophisticates who are asking questions because really they have no idea what they're talking about? Or is there a massive censorship mafia out there that is funded to the tune of tens of millions of dollars that is specifically designed to go after and destroy anybody who asks the wrong questions? I'll leave that one for my audience to decide for themselves. So, the nature of the specific disagreement that we have been seeing unfold comes down to the following. What does it mean to exact a proportionate retaliation in war? Did America use excessive force in World War II when they dropped atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima? Did they use excessive force when they completely leveled Dresden and then leveled it again and again and again?
We were supposed to be the good guys. We was going to war to rescue Europe from the evil of the Third Reich. And we finished up being worse than they were.
Are there aspects of history that we have been lied to about? And is it a case that history is just written by the winners and that not everything is as it seems? And then if that is the case, then why on earth should we trust a single word that comes out of their mouth without ruthlessly questioning everything? And then obviously this question then bleeds into the war that's happening in Gaza. Are we seeing another example of collective punishment that is being inflicted upon a civilian population? And if you want to delve further into this and you haven't watched the debate on Zero Hedge between Dave Smith versus Dennis Prager, amongst others, then I would recommend you go and watch that. You listen to both sides, you listen carefully, and you decide who you think is right. And by the way, this is not just to say that Western countries are uniquely bad, uniquely evil, and the other guys are actually the good guys. Not at all. But it is to say that one of the fundamental pillars of these great Western civilizations that we have built is that we are meant to have the freedom to ask questions, to criticize our governments, and to use the will of the people to demand a higher standard of our leaders. And we must necessarily be able to do this if we want to honestly call ourselves the beacon of democracy and freedom in the world. It's that simple. Otherwise, we are hypocrites. Even if these conversations are deeply uncomfortable and very difficult, even if the questions and objections that we have are totally wrong, if we continue to shut down dialogue, as has been happening, then we inevitably become the totalitarian societies that we are allegedly trying to bring democracy to. So, with all of that in mind, let's have a look at some of the takes that have been occurring recently and some of the people that have been chiming in. Here's what Tucker has been saying, followed by some responses from Ben Shapiro.
I love, by the way, that people on my side, I'll just admit it, on the right, have spent the last 80 years defending dropping nuclear weapons on civilians. Like, are you joking?
Right.
That's just like prima facie evil.
Yeah.
If you can't, if we hadn't done that, then this, that, the other thing, that was actually a great savings. Like, no, it's wrong to drop nuclear weapons on people. And if you find yourself arguing that it's a good thing to drop nuclear weapons on people, then you are evil.
The fact is the Nazis were trying to develop nuclear weapons. There was, in fact, a nuclear arms race that was happening at the time. Not only that, as it turns out, the Soviet Union then developed nuclear weapons. And it is mutually assured destruction and nuclear deterrence that has kept the world largely from sinking into another World War III-like mass casualty morass because of the horror of dropping the nuclear bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the first place. By the way, when he says things like, how exactly would you justify, why are we talking about how many lives it would save? It's just wrong to drop the bomb. Well, no, actually, if you end up saving more lives than are cost by the dropping of the atomic bomb, then it is morally justified to drop the atomic bomb. And that happens to be the reality of the situation.
Guys, just before we get on to the next bit, if you're enjoying this video and if you want to see it go far and wide, don't forget to smash that like button and also subscribe to the channel by hitting that big red button below. Back to it.
And I do think there are war crimes that the United States committed during the Second World War, the firebombing of Tokyo, famously Dresden, that were collective punishment. And I would also say, by the way, the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that's collective punishment.
Yes.
Okay? And I think that rotted the soul of the West. I do.
Yes.
I think that's so immoral that it did two things. One, you carry the burden of sin at scale like that. You just do. You can't help it. And two, that level of power in the hands of human beings convinced them that they were gods.
Yes, it's curious because you would hear a comparable argument offered for slavery, for example, that this burden is borne by American culture, and yet I've never heard anyone advance it around the acts of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I wanted to...
We dropped atomic weapons on civilian populations.
Yes.
Now, I'm not endorsing Imperial Japan.
Yes.
And it was an imperial power in the worst sense. Horrible government. However, you can't annihilate a civilian population and call yourself the good guy. I don't care. I love America. I will defend America almost under any circumstances. You can't defend that.
Well, I mean, I at this point, I kind of want to know which circumstances, because I feel like the defense of America, especially on the foreign policy sphere, just for Tucker does not exist particularly a lot. Again, I have the same views as Tucker does when it comes to closing the southern border. I have many of the same views that Tucker does about the decreasing religiosity of the West. In fact, I think I've been saying it longer than Tucker has probably. But what's weird here is that when Tucker is criticizing the United States as embodying some sort of original sin that sprang from World War II, is that Tucker actually doesn't believe this about foreign leaders killing people. So when it comes to the moral calculus of leaders killing people, that's the realm of normal politics. So for example, he will downplay Vladimir Putin's evil in killing his political opponents and invading sovereign countries and killing civilian populations in those sovereign countries by basically saying all leaders kill people. But when it comes to ending World War II by dropping the bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which did bring an end to the war, that is a moral stain, a moral blight that America simply has been corrupted by.
Ben's old friend and now arch nemesis Candace Owens also weighed in on the matter, going on an absolute rampage on Twitter, bringing further attention to the history of World War II that we simply don't learn about. Candace said Tucker derangement syndrome is real, and then she quoted General Henry H. Arnold, commanding general of the U.S. Army Air Forces under President Truman. Quote, "It always appeared to us that atomic bomb or no atomic bomb, the Japanese were already on the verge of collapse." Another quote from General Dwight D. Eisenhower. "Japan was at that moment seeking some way to surrender with a minimal loss of face. It wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing." Candace went on to say, "Needless to say, every American has a right to evaluate whether the drastic measure of dropping a nuke on a non-military target in a country that had been on the defense for 2 years plus negotiating their surrender was necessary. You may ultimately conclude that it was or was not. But your right to think critically and express your views is about as American as it gets." She went on to say, "We'll also add here some Christian historical facts. In Nagasaki, the bomb was dropped 300 yards from a Catholic church, Murakami Cathedral. Nagasaki was the epicenter of Japanese Catholicism, home to the second largest cathedral in the East. Church was in session when the bomb dropped. Of the approximately 12,000 Christians living there at the time, 8,500 were killed, including several dozen parishioners and 2 Catholic priests who were hearing confessions in the cathedral that morning. Very few military men were killed. The overwhelming majority of victims were women and children." She also went on to say, "Conservatives are not warring with one another. What we are observing are neocons in freefall, lashing out at others on their way down." So there's obviously a lot more to this, guys, and I can't speak about the stories and post the links that I would like to speak about and post here on YouTube. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to post them all in my Telegram group. You guys can find that Telegram group at the top of the comments there. Vivek Ramaswamy also came out and gave a valuable take on this, defending Tucker Carlson's First Amendment right to ask questions.
I find it fascinating that many conservatives are now lambasting Tucker Carlson for asking certain hard questions about narratives we've been fed by the government. Do I agree with Tucker on all of his views? Of course not. I don't agree with anybody on 100% of their views. That would be a weird thing to do. But I also think it's a weird thing to do to lambast somebody for questioning certain narratives when in fact that's what it means to be a skeptical citizen of a truly democratic nation. I'll tell you where it comes from though. I'm not just going to tar somebody on their side. Let's get to the heart of what's going on there. I think we as conservatives have appropriately been fed up by the self-loathing left that has repeatedly for 160 years and for the last 6 years incessantly questioned the founding of our country, obsessing over systemic racism and white rage and the original sin of slavery at our founding. And at a certain point, all of us, most conservatives I know, myself included, Tucker included, others, are saying enough with it already. Let's move forward as one country because we've beaten that dead horse to death. There's nothing more to say. Now, back in 1960, when you didn't have necessarily equal rights enjoyed across this country, that was still a relevant conversation to have, to say, well, slavery existed all the way through the Civil War. The Reconstruction era didn't quite put an end to those inequities. How are we going to deal with it in the Civil Rights Revolution? That was a reasonable discussion to have. But now we're 60 plus years after that, and at a certain point, it's time to move on. And if you're consistently still obsessing over narratives dating back over 250 years, then yes, that means you probably do in some measure hate this country. Fine. But that's different from saying that there are certain areas where we deserve to question our own history that haven't been questioned. And I think that that's the difference we need to draw. The distinction we need to draw is one thing to beat a dead horse and hate ourselves for the sake of hating ourselves. That's what the modern left does. But that's not what Tucker's doing. To the contrary, he's turning over rocks that haven't really been turned over, rolling over logs that deserve to be rolled over and seeing what crawls out. Sometimes maybe there's nothing there. Is he going to have a 100% hit rate? Of course not. But I don't think it's the right thing to do, especially as conservatives who are supposed to be skeptical of the government, to criticize somebody for asking questions, and not just in an armchair way, but in a rigorous way, asking the kinds of questions that at least the American people deserve to have answers to and closure on. I think that's a good thing. And whether you're liberal or conservative, I think you actually do love this country if you're willing to ask those hard questions. And that's why I think it's a mistake, an unintentional mistake that many conservatives make when they try to tell people to shut up, sit down, and do as they're told. That's what the modern progressive left does. Let's not make the same mistake in return.
So I completely agree with Vivek there. I mean, it's important to be able to turn over these logs and not have these taboo subjects that you can't even talk about. And when you do see these topics arise, the ones that we are, of course, forbidden to talk about, you should be even more skeptical and ask yourself, what are they trying to hide? I mean, I don't really see anybody fighting tooth and nail to try and silence the flat earthers. I don't see anybody really fighting to try and silence the people who think that Australia is not real, which, by the way, guys, is a real conspiracy theory.
Australia does not exist.
In a healthy society, we should be able to have these difficult conversations. We should be able to flesh out the truth and move forward with this knowledge and with those lessons in mind. And now let's finish off with a very interesting clip where Piers Morgan is interviewing/debating, for some reason, John Mearsheimer, who is a real expert in history and especially in foreign policy. In fact, John Mearsheimer is the author of this book, The Israel Lobby and US Foreign Policy. Good book. Piers and John talk about the morality of war, the morality of using nuclear weapons if America overreacted in World War II, and also the future of international politics.
Let me ask you about the morality of nuclear weapons. Tucker Carlson was on Joe Rogan's podcast this week and said that he believed that it was effectively immoral, evil, that the Allied powers in World War II were not justified in dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which killed over 200,000 civilians. Where do you sit with the morality of this? Is it ever justified morally to deploy nuclear weapons?
Well, I think that if you use nuclear weapons to effectively murder huge numbers of civilians, you're committing a war crime. I personally believe that the firebombing of Japan, which took place before we dropped those nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and here you want to remember, Piers, that we killed more people the first night we firebombed Tokyo than we killed at either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Yeah. So we were murdering huge numbers of Japanese civilians well before we dropped those nuclear weapons. I think it's a war crime. And I believe Curtis LeMay said to Robert McNamara at the time, they were both with 20th Air Force in the Pacific, that if we lost the war, they would be tried at the next set of Nuremberg trials. So I think it was a war crime. But what happens when countries get into desperate straits, and we felt we were in desperate straits at the time because we did not want to invade the Japanese home islands. We thought that the casualties would be huge. We thought it was appropriate to drop those bombs on Japan. And I think that the people who did it were fully aware that they were killing massive numbers of civilians, that this was effectively a war crime. But I think they believed that the ends justified the means.
If by dropping those bombs, as most experts would say was the case, you prevented potentially millions more people being killed, including many more civilians than died in those two bomb attacks, is that not moral justification for doing it, in the sense of, yes, it's horrendous, yes, the loss of civilian life is appalling and unprecedented, but it will save maybe 5-10 times as many civilians getting killed in the longer run if this war goes on?
You can make that argument for sure, and many people made it at the time. I understand the argument full well, but I think the fact of the matter is you are still murdering huge numbers of civilians. And if you think murdering, I think we probably murdered about 900,000 civilians between March 10th, 1945 and mid-August 1945. If you think murdering 900,000 civilians is justified because in the long run it will save more lives, you can make that argument. But again, I still think it's committing a war crime.
I mean, if you categorize all civilian deaths in a war like that as murder, you're effectively saying that every one of those deaths is a crime. I would not argue that what the Allies did in response to what the Nazis and the Japanese were doing was a crime, necessarily. They were responding to an existential threat to the world, including mass murder of civilians, as we saw with the Holocaust. So a response is not necessarily murder, is it? It's effectively self-defense.
The question you have to ask yourself is whether or not you think because the Nazis were committing genocide, because the Nazis were committing mass murder in Europe, that justifies bombing German cities and purposely killing huge numbers of civilians. Do you think that lets you off the hook? That's the argument you're making. You're saying that because the Germans were so horrible, we were allowed to be horrible ourselves, but we weren't as horrible as the Germans, and furthermore, we were doing this in self-defense. That's the argument you're making.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is, I understand that there are strategic imperatives for killing civilians, right? This is why we bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki with nuclear weapons. We thought that it made good strategic sense and that it would save American lives, especially those GIs who would have to invade the Japanese home islands. But I still think that that is a case of war crimes. And I think that to use your rhetoric lets us off the hook.
How does any country defend itself from an existential threat like the Nazis, then, by your categorization, without committing war crimes?
Well, if you look at how the Soviets, who were basically responsible for defeating the Nazis in World War II, they did not commit many war crimes in the process of defeating the Wehrmacht. It was basically a ground war where the Soviets, the Red Army, rolled up the Wehrmacht. There were no bombing of cities. There were no dropping of nuclear weapons. Now, there's no question that there was a lot of rape and pillaging, especially at the end, as the Red Army moved into Germany. But aside from that, this was not a purposeful campaign to murder huge numbers of civilians. So you can fight a war on the ground involving two armies that basically avoids the problem of bombing cities and murdering huge numbers of civilians.
What if the Nazis are bombing cities, as they were?
What do you mean? I'm not defending that.
Well, it's like the Battle of Britain, the Blitz. I mean, if they're going to send over bombers and just attack cities in the way that they did, how do you defend yourself without committing war crimes by your assessment?
Well, the British defended themselves with fighter aircraft. The RAF fended off the Luftwaffe and won the Battle of Britain. The RAF, the British, did not commit war crimes to defeat the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. There's no question that the RAF, at different points in the war, purposely targeted German cities and purposely tried to murder large numbers of British civilians. You know the story of Bomber Harris for sure.
Yeah.
But that's not what happened in the Battle of Britain. And my only point is, if you talk about what Bomber Harris did and the RAF did against German cities, this was a war crime. They were purposely bombing working class areas in German cities because that they believed would maximize, that strategy would maximize the number of civilians.
Well, they wasn't as simple as that, were they? Because they were deliberately targeting industrial cities in the main, which were being used to build munitions as well. So there was a legitimate reason to target these cities. But that was the case in many cases.
That's not true.
Yes, it is.
No, but no, I mean, what happened was that the British quickly found out, and this is what happened to us when we bombed Japan. We quickly found out that bombing economic and military targets didn't work. I could walk you through the story about the bombing of Japanese cities like Tokyo. It didn't work. And the reason we turned to bombing civilians, to killing civilians when we bombed Japan, and this was true with regard to Bomber Harris, is that bombing economic targets didn't work.
Let me, I've found this conversation, as always, fascinating, Professor Meerschaum. I love having you on. It's been quite a downbeat interview, I have to say, for obvious reasons. Are you positive about the future of mankind, or are you selling at this stage?
I'm quite pessimistic about the future of international politics. I think if you look at what's going on in Ukraine and you just think about the conversation that you and I were having, it's hard to think that the future doesn't look as depressing as the present and the recent past with regard to Ukraine. If you look at the Middle East, I mean, I see no hope there. This terrible situation is just going to go on and on. The Iran-Israel case that we talked about will pop up again in the future. And if you look into the situation in East Asia, what you see is that the US and the Chinese are engaged in this intense security competition where there's a real possibility of a war in the future over Taiwan or the South China Sea or the East China Sea. And then there are all sorts of other places you can look, like the Korean Peninsula, the border between India and China. And it seems like there's no end of potential war or potential conflict between the major powers in the system and even the minor powers in the international system. And then when you look inside states and you look at what's happening, if you look at what's happening to liberal democracy around the world, it's not a pretty picture. Look at the United States, look at Britain. Two of the paradigmatic liberal democracies, they're both in serious trouble. So I hate to say this, but I find very few reasons to be optimistic about the future. And sometimes I think I'm glad that I was born after World War II and I lived, most of my life in the 20th and early 21st century, because when I think about moving forward, again, doesn't look like a pretty picture.
So difficult to disagree with John there about the future of international politics, especially when you consider the war in the Middle East and how that is escalating, the spiritual, religious component to that war, and also the powerful financial interests at play. I think that Julian Assange summed this up pretty well when it came to Afghanistan.
Because the goal is not to completely subjugate Afghanistan. The goal is to use Afghanistan to wash money out of the tax bases of the United States, out of the tax bases of European countries, through Afghanistan and back into the hands of a transnational security elite. That is the goal, i.e. the goal is to have an endless war, not a successful war. So Stop the War Coalition is important because we have to prevent it becoming normal for there to be a constant war. Very soon, within the next few years, it will become the normal for there to be a constant war in the West. People will reach maturity and adulthood under the understanding that there is always a war. And at that point, war will not be something that is unusual or surprising or horrifying. War will become the new normal.
So, apologies for the heavy video, guys. I did not mean to black pill you all today, but it's certainly not a very joyful topic, but we got to call it as we see it. just asking questions. Anyways, that's enough from me, guys. As I said before, if you want to find my Telegram, that's going to be below with all my other links. If you'd like to subscribe to the channel, right here. If you want to watch another video, click right here. Till next time, I'm Jake. This is Rattlesnake TV, keeping you armed and dangerous.